So as you can see, our next presentation is a very hot topic, and it's one that you might say almost blindsided us a number of years ago. I would say within the last 10 years, although I think a number of people saw it coming because of the worldview change and so forth. But we are privileged to have with us here today, and he is going to be sharing his thoughts with you online. The first part of his presentation is recorded, and so at the end of his presentation, Dr. Paul Wendland will be joining us live for a Q&A. So I've observed Dr. Wendland from a distance over the years, and I realized as I was watching him and observing him and reading him that he had some really keen insight in a number of issues, and he was very much worldview oriented. And I saw that when I was down in San Antonio, and he made a visit down there and talked with a number of us pastors down there. But then I saw it very clearly again after I read his most recent article on the subject of transgenderism. And so Paul has served as president of the Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary, the Wells Seminary, and now he continues to teach New Testament there at WLS. So let us now welcome Dr. Paul Wendland.
The Transgenderism Incursion. What to think, how to love. That's the title of my presentation today. Let me begin with an anecdote that says to me, anyway, a lot about changes in society and differences between the generations. I remember having a conversation with my dad in the 1970s. I once brought up the subject of the rising gay liberation movement. His reaction was quick and visceral. It was almost physical. He just shuddered and he said, "Perversion." I got to admit that at the time I was a little bit surprised because I didn't have quite that same visceral reaction. I knew that the gay lifestyle was wrong, but I had grown up in a world where it was just more accepting of an alternate lifestyle, as they used to say. These days, when I speak to my own pious daughters, who regularly attend a church and have been surrounded by the Word of God since their youth, I can't help but notice the incursion of differing attitudes. Let me put it this way. Just as I did not feel the same way as my father about the gay revolution, I mean, I knew it was wrong, and I knew it was something that was contrary to the Bible's way, but it wasn't something that caused me to shudder. So in the same way, my daughters know intellectually and biblically that transgenderism is wrong, but they don't necessarily feel it in their bones. They don't experience it as the great rebellion against natural law that in fact it is. What's more, my daughter tells me that even natural law itself doesn't work as an argument with her generation of millennials. To me, that says just a huge amount about the differences in society as time goes on and the differences between generations, and at least gives us an entree into some of the issues that we have to deal with today as we think about worldview and competing worldviews. And even as I say these things, I'm also reminded that in any presentation there are all these subcultures that we're talking about. And I have to deal with the question of audience. To whom am I speaking? Am I talking to card-carrying Lutherans who have been so for generations? Am I talking to older people that may have a certain attitude towards things? You know, the okay boomer set, like myself. Am I talking to younger people who grew up in a different America than I grew up in? Am I talking to people that are confused by the outrageous claims made by the transgender movement? Am I talking to people who have been victimized by it and falling under its sway or struggling with its ideas? Am I talking to people who, when they hear that I think that the transgender movement is not such a good thing, immediately are inclined to classify me as a hater who has no regard for the rights of others? So our challenge as we discuss this is going to be to maintain a battle on two fronts. both combating the ideology itself, and by that I mean the worldview that sees this transgender movement as something that's just right, it's sensible. So we're going to have to do battle with those angels in the architectures, those high-topped towers of thought that pit themselves against the truth of Christ. At the same time, though, maintaining compassion for those who are victimized by this way of thinking, who are struggling against it, who are falling prey to it. And that's a tricky thing. Before we discuss the transgender worldview, we really have to center ourselves in the biblical worldview. I spent the summer of 2019 studying this issue, and it was such a long journey, and I read so much from both sides on the issue that I was finding myself becoming confused. And so just to get my mind right, I wrote some basic Bible passages on my whiteboard in my room, just so I wouldn't lose my mind. And here they are. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. That tells me that human beings are God's good creation. He created them as male and female, that is, with a binary gender and a binary sexuality for the purposes of family and marriage. Now, someone might argue that the fall changed everything, and now humanity is so radically marred by sin that our essence has been kind of destroyed, and these categories are so packed with sin that whatever was true before is no longer true of Adam and Eve after the fall. Now, we can certainly agree that it's utterly true to say that sin has left its marks on our sexuality. And we can talk more about that later. But the goodness of God's creation hasn't changed, no matter how perverse or disordered our thinking becomes. Jesus affirms the essential truth of God's good purpose in creation when he's discussing divorce with the Pharisees. He says, "Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female?" In other words, he's appealing to the creation order, how God set things up in the beginning. And he says that should have an impact on how we look at this matter of divorce today. And so what is true about divorce is also true about the transgender movement. God hasn't changed his basic order of male and female. We should also be very clear in our minds what false god is ruling the hearts of so many today. And by that I mean the great lie that has sometimes been called the autonomous choosing self. What that means is just the philosophy that a person should be free to do whatever he wants so long as he doesn't, and then you fill in the blank. So long as he doesn't what? So long as he doesn't hurt anybody. I think you were all thinking that, weren't you? Or to say the same thing in a different way, I have the right to be whatever I want to be without others shaming me into conformity with their narrow morality. Don't make me ashamed of being who I am. I should be free to be me. So the ideology of the transgender movement is really that notion that what we want to be in and of ourselves should be considered the center of who we really are. Carl Trueman puts it that way in a recent article in First Things. Even more, the ideology states that my sense of who I am, however I fit on the spectrum between male and female, and they think of it as a spectrum or a continuum, however I fit on the spectrum between male and female, what I feel is more important than whatever biological bodily equipment I was born with. The soul, or the spirit, is really more important than the body. My feelings, how I feel about myself, is more important than what I see in my physical nature. So, if I feel like a man trapped in a woman's body, I should be free to take whatever action I need to take to conform my body to my feelings, rather than seek to change my feelings to conform to my body. Does that make sense? I should be free to change my body to fit my feelings rather than to change my feelings to fit my body. Furthermore, gender itself can be radically separated from one's birth or biological sex. Now, I could grant that gender as a cultural concept might differ from nation to nation. So I would say the gender roles in Central Africa for man and woman might be different and conceived of differently than the gender roles in North America. Well, the gender roles that my father and mother had for each other are not exactly the same as the gender roles that exist between my wife and I. These things change over time. So certainly I can see that gender is helpful as a way of thinking how a person is conscious of maleness, how a person is conscious of femaleness. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? That's gender. And sex is biology, okay? So I get that there is a useful distinction to be made, but that's not what gender ideology is talking about. They want to make a radical separation between your birth sex and your biological sex and your sense of gender. That gender can be radically separated from who you are in your biological equipment. So my gender sense can be fluid and change. It can change even day by day. It's not something that arises out of my physical sexuality and therefore in some sense is fixed at birth. Well, we've clearly come a long way from the modernist world of the 50s and the 60s, the Leave It to Beaver world, as some might call it, those of you who can remember that far back. That was a world in which people believed that there were certain objective facts about gender and sex and family and society. There was a man and there was a woman, and they got together and they got married until death us do part. And this was a fundamental building block of society. This allowed Daniel Patrick Moynihan, whom you see pictured here, express the thought that everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. There are objective facts out there, and you can have your opinion, but you can't change the facts. Well, that's not true anymore. Nowadays, we live more in a Humpty Dumpty world where words pretty much mean whatever anybody wants them to mean. All so-called facts are just interpretations or opinions, or worse, tools we use to manipulate others and get them to do what we want. Ideas calculated to win power and maintain certain people in power. So the only question that matters is not what the facts are, but who's the master, who's in charge. As Humpty Dumpty says, the question is, which is to be master? That's all. Words mean what I want them to mean. And when you think about it, who can really be blamed for thinking this way? Every day we are surrounded by people who are trying to sell us something. Every day we are surrounded by fake news and spin doctors. But there's even a worse affliction than all this fogginess around truth. And that is the disease of believing that there is no sun that can shine through the fog. There is no objective truth at all, no God's eye point of view of the universe. And there is no natural law, no natural order. The only truth is you got to fake it till you make it. It's all spin, lies, fog, fairy dust. What's at stake here is not simply the poor souls who are impacted by these powerful deceptions. What's at stake are fundamental questions such as, what is a human being? What is the purpose of our sexuality? What is marriage? What is the family? These are fundamental questions, the answers to which affect the foundations of society. We live in an age where everyone is moving the boundary stones. We are witnessing the changing of norms that have enjoyed the consensus of centuries. Yet as we serve in this confusion, we absolutely need to keep our heads as we consider the question of audience. We simply must maintain compassion for the victims of this ideology, for the bullied girl who sees a different gender as a way out, for the young people of our country who have been confused by their peers and see this as a matter of simple justice. We need to remember as we speak to maintain compassion for the intersex, those who have been born with a biology that does not clearly indicate whether they are man or woman. We need to remember the parents of a child who struggle because their child has expressed for many years feelings of deep alienation to their birth gender. These things are real. We don't have to buy the ideology, but we have to recognize that there are people that are troubled and struggling with these issues. And as I think of what our great temptation might be as a church body, I should think the likeliest outcome for us all would be to say, let's draw up the drawbridges and shut the gates against this pagan horde that is threatening us, and let us find safety in the citadel of the church. To see the church as a safety zone for saints rather than a hospital for the sick and injured is a terrible error. Quite simply, it means that we could lose or be losing our heart for the lost. God preserve us from that horror. One of the problems in getting at this subject, however, is trying to understand all the bewildering terms and vocabulary surrounding it. It truly is dense. Even more, it's one that's constantly changing. Terms that used to be in fashion under the Bible of Psychiatry, DSM-4, are no longer in vogue in DSM-5. Those are both versions of this Bible of psychiatric disorders. What used to be called in DSM-4 gender identity disorder is now in DSM-5 called gender dysphoria. I'm happy to talk about any of these various terms that you see in the Q&A, but I think I'm just going to focus on a couple of their main arguments for us to understand what is going on. Probably the strongest argument for gender fluidity is the scientific fact that there are a grouping of congenital conditions under the term intersex. This is a birth defect. For those who suffer from it, it is not always clear either from the genitals or the chromosomes in the body or the way the body takes on hormones, whether the child is male or female. This set of birth defects is real, occurring in various combinations, yet relatively rare. It all depends on who's counting and what syndromes are being included, but estimates range from there's 2 people out of every 10,000 to 1 in every 1,000 people is affected by some sort of intersex condition. Some are very severe, some not so much. While we would certainly not deny that this condition exists, we see no reason why it should be an argument for gender being something that is fluid and changeable, just the opposite. While we wouldn't deny that it has an emotional impact on those who suffer from this condition, it's clearly a physical defect, and it needs to be treated. But gender dysphoria, in the majority of cases, is a condition that has no physical origin, just the opposite. Doctors and biologists realize that the differentiation between male and female goes right down to the cells. As one philosopher put it, every cell has a sex. A feeling of gender dysphoria in and of itself is certainly a real thing and requires emotional treatment, but there is no physical cure for an issue of the mind. In fact, there is no unambiguous evidence that sex reassignment surgery, which is the end of the road in a sense, the highest form of a solution, the most radical solution, there is no evidence that is unambiguous that sex reassignment surgery offers permanent and lasting relief from feelings of gender dysphoria. I'll give you just one statistic that demonstrates this pretty clearly. The attempted suicide rate in the general population of the United States is under 5%. That would be 5 people out of every 100 attempt at some point in their lives to commit suicide. Now, among the transgendered, this is really phenomenal. Among the transgendered, 41%, that is 41 out of every 100 have attempted suicide. And this, despite all the various physical interventions employed to bring the body into conformity with the mind. Those solutions apparently don't work. And as long as we're talking about therapies, let's spend a minute following up on what the American Academy of Pediatricians suggests is the only appropriate therapy for gender dysphoria. Here is where things really start getting murky. The recommended course of therapies are given the name GATS, meaning gender-affirming therapies. The emphasis is on that word affirmative, supportive. You don't contradict. You don't say, well, it's only in your head, or this is an emotional thing and we need to work on those emotions. It's simply giving affirmation and support if someone says, I feel like I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or I feel like I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. This includes affirmative counseling, which leads eventually to puberty blockers at a certain point, then hormone therapies, and finally the sex reassignment surgeries that I was talking about before, where the body is, I can't think of no other word to describe it, mutilated to represent and resemble the opposite sex. The American Academy of Pediatricians specifically rejects other forms of therapy, and this is where it really gets murky. For example, as recently as 2004, there was one group of doctors that advocated a very sensible course of therapy called wait and see. Since over 70% of males and well over 50% of females with gender dysphoria found that those feelings that they had of being trapped in the wrong gender, they simply resolved over time. 70% of males, over 50% of women. This therapy then suggests simply watching and waiting. You still offer talk therapy, emotional support in that sense to the child, but the thought is it will just resolve itself over time if you just let it. The American Academy of Pediatricians feels that this is not supportive enough. And of course, any Christian who might come along saying we need to help them if they are biological girls to inhabit their bodies as girls, or if they are biological men to inhabit in mind their bodies as men, they would regard us as completely out of the picture. We are completely condemned. And they would say it's forbidden by law to try to make them feel comfortable in their own skin, so to speak. They would consider this to be a conversion therapy. And many states have laws on the books that ban therapies that try to convert gay men into straight men and gay women into straight women. And so they say this is exactly the same thing. You should not try to convert someone into being what he isn't. So the assumption is from the very get-go that when one expresses feelings like this, that those feelings need to be supported, affirmed, to the point of giving puberty blockers, to the point of giving hormone treatments, and, if the person desires it, also sex reassignment surgery. Pause and think what this means if you have a child, and that child falls into the hands of someone who espouses the ideology of the American Academy of Pediatricians. Let's say this child expresses some feelings of alienation towards his or her gender. The doctor, his role is clear. He must support, even encourage the feelings. Certainly not to treat it as some kind of a problem. He is concerned about the child's welfare to this degree that he is to seek to create safe spaces for the child in his family and in the community, so that the child can express its gender as it pleases. In other words, if you are a parent who has misgivings about your child identifying with the opposite sex. You'd better get in line and learn how to support your child in the way experts tell you, or you could be in trouble. You could be in trouble as an unfit parent visiting harm upon your own children. Now, this just seems to be a pretty obvious attack upon the family and the rights of parents to raise their own children. But it's more than that. It's really a plain failure of care. A plain failure of care to encourage children along a path that could end in radical surgery. How does that make sense? Nobody knows the long-term effects of puberty blockers and hormone treatments on children's bodies. It's a vast experimentation that's going on people's bodies with no real proof that it helps. Remember, 4 out of 10 transgendered people, even though they receive these therapies, still attempt suicide. From a natural law perspective, it seems the equivalent of telling a teenage girl who suffers from anorexia that, you got a few pounds too many. You could shed a few. It seems crazy, but this is the world we live in. For the rest of our time, I want to focus on only one basic pro and con, the argument for and the argument against. Time is not going to permit an in-depth discussion of either one, but I'm hoping that some of this can come out in the question and answer period afterwards. Far more important, I think, is for us to sketch out what a good practice might be in addressing this issue among us. The essential argument for gender fluidity is summarized well by a certain gender-creative parent whom I'm quoting here. He did not want to raise his child to conform to any gender other than whatever the child wanted over time declared himself to be. So you see how feelings are really determinative. These parents, of course, know what their child's biological sex is, but as gender-creative parents, they believe it is important to let their children create their own gender identity. Anyway, as you can see on the slide, this parent declares, "I'm very tired of the heteronormative and cisnormative model. I'm very tired of the patriarchy. A part of why we are parenting this way is because intersex people exist, and transgender people exist, and queer people exist, and sex and gender occur on a spectrum. Yet our culture loves to think that people, all 7 billion of them, can and should be reduced to either or, the gender binary." Couple things to notice here. First of all, notice how radically separated gender is from one's biological sex. And if one's sense of gender identity is different from one's biological sex, then the mind is to trump the body. Whatever you desire, so shall it be, and so shall people regard you. Whatever you desire, that is what you are. And if it means surgery to bring your body in line with your mind and spirit, then so shall it be. It really is a modern form of Gnosticism that privileged the spirit over the body, as people like Nancy Pearcey point out. You notice some of the terms that he uses here as well. He speaks of the cisnormative model, the heteronormative model. This would be the idea that there's a man and there's a woman. There's basically two sexes, a heteronormative model. Cisnormative model would be someone who is a male biologically and identifies as a male in his gender, or a woman who is a woman in her biology and identifies as a woman in her gender identity. He also connects this with the patriarchy, the bad old idea that men should marry women, and that is just a way of keeping women down and asserting the power of a certain block of people. What can you say? The essential natural law argument against has been made very simply and elegantly by Karl Bratton, of all people. He states it this way: since the dawn of human civilization and across all cultures, human beings have known that the male and female organs are made for different functions. Humans know what they are. They are free to act in accordance with them or act in opposition to them. The organs match. What is so difficult to understand about that? Humans learn these things by reason and nature. No books on anatomy, psychology, or sociology are needed. The truth is, and this would be the truth of natural law, for most people, gender and sex are stable and binary. Male and female created he them. This is the human consensus and experience of centuries. Intersex people are the exception that prove the rule. One does not make birth defects the norm of the human race. One does not make anomalies the way we ought to go. One does not make anomalies normative. This ideology is deadly to marriage, as we've said, deadly to the family, and therefore deadly to human society. As far as marriage is concerned, it has already been reduced to a mere societal convention or some kind of a contract between two people of any sex or any gender who agree somehow to partner until they don't feel like it anymore, an indeterminate period of time. How can you define marriage anymore, really, other than a contract of two people to gather together and protect each other as an economic unit for a period of time? If you can't define it, how can the law protect it? It really is impossible for the law to protect anything so ill-defined. And those that will suffer, as they always do, are the vulnerable in society, like women and children who no longer have the protection of marriage, the hated old patriarchy. We can well expect to be accused of being haters, people who want to advance this patriarchy by saying these things. It might seem to be more loving to empathize and support with those who embrace these alternative ideologies. We must recognize that many of our own children are tempted to see the world this way. But it is not hatred to speak the truth. In fact, there can be no love without truth. The firm and solid rock of truth, of course, is the Holy Scriptures. Whatever natural law may prove or fail to prove, Scripture is our final and most certain resting place. Here we do not argue, we do not debate, we simply stand before the throne of grace and confess what our God has given us to confess. I've heard it said, because of the propaganda in society and perhaps because of struggles in their own family, even some of our own members may wonder whether it's really worth fighting this battle. After all, couldn't we just say, live and let live, different strokes for different folks? This is why I think it is so important to demonstrate that what's at stake here is the faith once delivered to the saints, that in all three articles of the creed, that basic creed that we were all taught as confirmands, all three articles are overturned by the idea structure of transgenderism. This is not a sideshow. It is rather an arrow aimed right at the heart of the Christian faith. First, a little technical talk. In order to accurately reflect what the Scriptures say, our confessions have taught us to distinguish human nature from our created human essence. Nature refers to the characteristics of something. Essence refers to its most basic makeup as something given and created by God. For example, I used to have dark brown hair. That was one of my characteristics. And now my hair, as you see, is gray. My characteristics are different, but essentially, body and soul, I am the same human being. I am still a creature of God. Now, why is this important? That though we are sinful in all our human characteristics, our basic makeup, body and soul, still comes from the hand of God. When we say with the psalmist, God has made me fearfully and wonderfully well, we are saying that we are still God's good creation, body and soul. Yes, it is absolutely true that because of Adam's sin, we are all corrupted in our natures, and that sin with a capital S has permeated every aspect of our nature or our human characteristics. That this corrupting effect of sin is undoubtedly seen even on a cellular level, perhaps. But God is still not ever the author of sin. We can still affirm our bodies and souls as God's good work. God forms and fashions us, sons and daughters of Adam and Eve as we are, so that He can make us clean of sin, so that He can make us holy, so that He can save us, body and soul. And when we are raised from death, we will still be the same human being we were before death, without the marks of sin and death upon us. Even though in the resurrection we will be gloriously free from sin, we are still the same human being that was planted in the ground, as Paul says. So, in conclusion, sin is not part of our created essence. That's why it's so wrong to say or to imply that God's creation of us as male or female doesn't matter. To say, God made me this way, born this way, God made me transgender, makes God the author of sin, the author of our corruption. To say that our gender is fluid is like the pot saying to the potter, I can be a dish plate if I want to be, or I can be a bowl, or I am a cup. God, you can't tell me what I am. A person cannot say, I believe in God the Creator, and then defy Him in this way. But it's not just the article of creation that's affected by this false teaching. It is also the doctrine of our redemption. We say with Scripture that Jesus became one of us, taking our human essence, body and soul, into Himself. He became a real human being, just like you and me. The only difference was He was without sin. That is why He is our brother, because He's just like us. He is our Redeemer, because He is a human being, just like us. He is our kinsman, because He is just like us. But if we say that a sinful characteristic like being transgender is part of our essential makeup, our created makeup, then Jesus is not our brother, because He did not take on any sinful characteristic. And then, if He is not our brother, He did not redeem us. On the other hand, if He took on a sinful characteristic and became like us also in our sin, then He couldn't redeem us, because one sinner can't redeem another. Either way, the article of redemption falls to the ground. We can no longer say with Luther, He has redeemed me, a lost and condemned creature, purchased and won me from sin, from death, and from the power of the devil, not with gold or silver, but with His holy, precious blood, and with His innocent sufferings and death. Finally, we also reject the third article of the Creed if we adopt the transgender ideology. Through the power of the gospel, God the Holy Spirit sets us free, not only from the guilt of sin, but from the power of sin to determine and control our lives. Paul says in Romans 6 that sin shall no more rule over you, because you are not under sin, but under grace. The sway of grace changes things. Yes, we still struggle against sin, and maybe sometimes we feel like we're losing the battle most of the time. But the fact is, there is a struggle going on, and we can fight against the sin that still dwells so powerfully within us. But if I say, I can't help it, God made me this way, transgender I was born, and transgender I will remain, then the struggle is over. I have surrendered to sin. And faith, true faith, cannot coexist with someone who has determined that he will remain in sin. These are the things we must continue to faithfully confess and teach, no matter what people call us, and no matter how much pressure we may feel from the world. At the same time, even though we are defending the faith, we don't want to be defensive about the faith. Our church, as I've said before, dare not become a citadel in which only the holy saints dwell. We may be tempted to withdraw from the world, but our Savior says, go into the world and preach the gospel. Let our churches become beacons of hope and comfort and joy and love, much like the early church in the Roman Empire, where emperors and philosophers had to acknowledge that there was an extraordinary love and compassion going on amongst those Christians. They were surprised. They take care of the poor, even when nobody else cares about them. They stay behind in times of plague and care for the sick. In other words, the church is a hospital for the sick. It's not a fortress for the healthy. That means we have to listen carefully, listen with our hearts to those who are afflicted, and offer compassion to them as they express their trauma. Very often it is a result of some psychic wound that leads someone to come out as transgender. Things like bullying, confusion in whether being called a tomboy means that they're more like a boy than a girl. Abuse of various kinds, even sexual, is often at the root. One psychologist I know tells me that he doesn't even bother talking about the issue of transgenderism as such in his first sessions. He says rather he always tries to find out what the trauma was that is lying at the root of it all. When that is discovered and dealt with, often the desire to be another gender goes away. We must keep in mind parents who are going through this. Maybe one of their own offspring need our love and support. I remember a father once coming to me and asking me how he should act towards his gay daughters. It had become a bone of contention between him and his wife. He had taken a staunch stand, he thought, and rejected them almost completely. They weren't even to come into his house, not even in Thanksgiving when he was there. His wife, on the other hand, was in anguish. I reminded him that our God, who certainly cares about sin, nevertheless causes his sun to shine on the evil and the good, and his rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Certainly, we want to be clear that sin is sin, but that doesn't mean we reject human beings or write them out of our lives. Youth are feeling enormous cultural pressure. If we wince when we are called haters, how much more when you are part of a generation where transgender ideology is just the way people think? We need to help them think clearly about these things, but also guard our own speech in such a way that we do not give the impression that we're a group of okay boomers who love to treat everybody that doesn't think our way with disdain and contempt. There's something personal here about this to me. When I think of some of the jokes that I've made about alcoholism amongst my classmates, the drunk jokes, and then later on to find out that some of those classmates died of alcoholism, I feel shame, and rightly so. When I think of the kind of dismissive and disdainful humor that sometimes comes out of people's mouths on this subject, I wonder why any teenager would want to approach such a person to speak about the troubles and the struggles in his heart. I'm not at all suggesting that church discipline be suspended. Of course, there will be some who demonstrate that they are impenitent. But let's distinguish between the truly impenitent and hardened and those who still struggle. And very often, especially when you're young, you put on a face of bravado, even though inwardly you may be melting. We all have sins against which we struggle. There's none of us that doesn't have stuff. Probably if I were in the real ministry again and not a semprof, I would be very careful as a pastor to have located ahead of time a counselor whose counsel I could trust. Obviously, there's differences in counselors. I would not seek to figure out how to help an individual who was struggling with these issues without psychological help and counseling. These are tough things, and they require the best we have to give. That doesn't mean, as a pastor, I would avoid being part of the solution. It's just that I know I don't have the skills of being a therapeutic listener that a counselor has. I want to make the journey with the struggling. I'm not going to abandon them, but obviously I don't have the skills of training that a genuine counselor does. I'm also urging empathy for the alienated, above all. And this should come in a certain way natural to Christians. I remember when I first went to Africa and I got beat up by the British boys because I was a Yank with a buzz haircut and a funny accent. I felt like a stranger in a strange land. I didn't know why people hated me, why they excluded me, just because of who I was. I went from being a pastor's kid and hot stuff on my Lutheran day school playground, and now I had become an object of derision and mockery for everybody. We all have experienced times like that in our lives. I know I'm not alone. Remember what that was like then, and have some sympathy for those who are experiencing similar things regarding their sexuality. Speaking of which, some of the toughest years of all of our lives were our adolescent years, weren't they? So many struggles to go through. What does it mean now that I'm a man? What does it mean now that I'm a woman? How do I know how to use my sexuality in correct ways? So much influence from our peers, and not all in a good way. We all have experienced feelings of estrangement and alienation for various reasons at various times. So it's natural, in a sense, to the human condition. But it's even more natural for Christians who themselves are, by nature of their new birth, as Peter says to first century Christians, you are strangers and you are aliens in this world. We are recapturing in these gray and latter days that sense of ourselves as a pilgrim church. We're walking this tough road together. We are strangers and pilgrims in this 21st century world. We know what it's like to be alienated and estranged from others because of our faith. And that gives us feelings of empathy for anyone who experiences any sort of feeling of alienation with regard to his sexuality. We know that the grace of Christ sees us through, and that it is the wisdom that we can share with others as we with pilgrim feet pitch our tent each evening, one day's journey closer to home. Yes, there is no love without truth. But Paul also reminds us that if we can fathom all mysteries and yet lack love, we're just resounding gongs or clanging cymbals. There is no truth without love either. We are fighting an ideology, that is true, but we need to fight that battle on two fronts, fighting the ideology while maintaining compassion for the wounded. Some resources that I've found that might be helpful to you in this matter. There's Nancy Percy, Love Thy Body, answering hard questions about life and sexuality. She comes from a Reformed Christian background, but I think you'll find her writing is very lucid and easy to follow and very, very helpful in thinking this thing through. If you're looking at a book that you might want to hand to somebody that is struggling with this on a congregational level, there's not everything that we would agree with. By all means, in Walker's God and the Transgender Debate, what does the Bible actually say about gender identity? But at least it has a high belief in Scripture. And generally speaking, it's a place to start if somebody wants to do some more reading on this as a congregation member. There is, of course, a rather long article that I just wrote on this subject in the Wisconsin Lutheran Quarterly, volume 117, number 1. As I say, it's pretty long and it's pretty technical. It's where this presentation comes from. I've kind of boiled it down, but if you're wondering where I'm coming from on some of these things, you might have recourse to looking at that longer article. And finally, Abigail Schreier, who has written for the Wall Street Journal. She has appeared on various conservative talk shows. She's a very courageous writer, especially when it comes to how this has impacted teenage young girls. She is someone who will help you understand a phenomenon called ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria. Apparently, there are a number of adolescent girls that suddenly, all at once, experience gender dysphoria. And this is really rather unusual because the typical definition of gender dysphoria is someone that experiences the alienation from their body at a fairly early age, pre-adolescence, and it goes on for a long time. It's almost how the person has always felt, and it's a hard feeling to shake. This is something where people have not experienced that in their prepubescent years, and then all of a sudden when adolescent girls get together at junior high, boom, it's called this rapid onset. That might be something to consider if you're doing some extra reading on this. And there's just a ton of material out there. My prayer is that this has shed more light than heat. I look forward to your questions. God bless you all in our pilgrim life.
Thank you, Dr. Wendland. Let's give him a round of applause. All right, again, we have our Q&A period here, and I think he's joining us live now. And so again, if you have a question, please step up to the mic, tell us who you are, where you're from. If you are online, use the Q&A again, tell us who you are and where you're from. And we've got about 15 minutes for this. So, Dr. Wendland, are you there?
Yes, I am. I think I am.
It's wonderful to see you. Thank you for your great contribution here to our conference. So, we have our first question. Bob?
Bob Wenslaw from Trinity, St. Timothy here. It was this transgender ideology, is this new to the cultures of the history, or has it occurred someplace else or sometime else, some other time?
There may be matriarchal societies that one can point to in the past. Am I broadcasting? Okay. There may have been some matriarchal societies in the past, gender confusion in the past, certainly. In the Roman Empire, there were certain examples. Sometimes people point to the ancient Greeks. Whenever I read the ancient Greeks, let's say on topics of being gay, I'm thinking it's never exactly the same. There's just distinctions, and there was a power relationship involved there that's not necessarily true in this trumpeting of really the overturn of natural law itself and common sense. It strikes me as being a unique phenomenon that we're seeing today. When I read the Greeks, I have a sense that there was they knew it wasn't the normal thing to do. There was a kind of a tee-heeing quality about it, but they did not try to walk around with signs saying this is normal. They made jokes about it in both Greek and Roman culture.
Thank you.
Do we have a question online, Stephen?
We do. Dr. Wendland, do you wish to read them, or should I read them for you?
I'm tired of my voice. Would you?
I'd be more than happy to. So, this is from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for your pastoral approach, Dr. Wendland. I'm trying to be vague here for obvious reasons, but we are dealing with the issues in the churches and have situations where individuals appear to be using the church as a safe place to experiment. When someone is obviously presenting opposite their physical sex, it is troubling to members and especially children, and at some level suggests that the church embraces transgenderism. What are your thoughts on requiring that visitors present according to their physical sex in order to attend services, especially repeat visitors after conversations have taken place with them?
Well, I think one of the issues, one of the things I would like to know more about as a pastor is I would like to know what the outcome of those conversations were. Were they fruitful? Was there a sense that this was an issue that needed to be dealt with? If someone, if you don't mention the elephant in the room, you can't really expect to deal with the issue. You have to deal with the issue. And if in those private conversations I'm dealing with an individual who recognizes that this could be problematic, one of the things I would suggest to the individuals, I'd say, look, you may not be there, you may still be a searcher, but for the sake of others, could you make this concession to us? Ultimately, I remember once in Salt Lake City, we had a card-carrying Mormon come consistently to our morning Bible study class. He came again and again, and at first we all welcomed him. It was fine, and there was a period, kind of a honeymoon, where everything was fine, and we would all make our Lutheran insights, and then he would come up with his Mormon explanation of whatever passage we were dealing with. And then finally, it got to the point where I realized that just as you say in your comment, that truth was being given equal rights to error. And so I took him aside one day and I said, look, for the sake of the others who are in that Bible class, I'm going to ask you not to come to that Bible class anymore, because I'm sending you a message that I don't want to send you, and that is that it really doesn't matter what you believe, and your beliefs are okay, when I sincerely believe that if you believe what you believe, you're really on a wrong road that could end up in outer darkness, which is their term for hell. So I said, I'll be willing to talk with you personally. I'll be willing to spend all the time you want. But as far as coming together and allowing truth to coexist with error on the same plane, that's not being fair to you, and it's not being fair to the people who are gathered in that Bible class. That didn't happen right away, but after it became clear that you're not dealing with someone that is weak or struggling, but you're dealing with somebody that in some sense is being defiant, then I think, or at least doesn't recognize that there's a problem. You have to make that clear.
Okay, Luke, please come to the mic.
Hello, I'm Luke. I'm a pastor in Iowa. Recently, I've had a lot of contact with the University of Iowa healthcare system, and at the bottom of a lot of emails that I get from the medical team, there is the required pronoun or suggested pronoun. I can't remember exactly how they phrase it, which I'd imagine is becoming more and more common in industry and business and technology and healthcare. I can just kind of ignore that in that context, but as a pastor, I haven't had to deal with it yet. If I would have an adolescent come to me and they are asking me to use their preferred gender pronoun, I don't know if you've given thought to a pastoral approach to that. I don't want to affirm a lie. At the same time, I want to be able to speak with them, but I mean, this really fits in with exactly what you're talking about. So I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts or practical advice about that specific, very narrow issue.
Yeah, thank you for your question. God bless you as you fight on the front lines. I'm always reminded that I'm answering these questions in the safe fastness of the Holy Hill in Mequon, and so I'm protected from some of those things. Initially, all I can tell you is what my practice was in the parish with similar things. I would first of all try to build a relationship of some kind with the individual, and if the relationship was contingent upon me calling them by their preferred pronoun, I might start by doing so. I don't know that I would end there, though. I would say, and I'd really like to talk to you about that, if you're open to discussing that, because it's really an important discussion that we need to have on that. certainly at some point I would feel that you'd have to bring that up. There's a lot of things that I don't particularly like about the way people dress or the way they present themselves to me that, in fact, I think are pretty offensive, that I might put up with for the sake of building an initial relationship. But that is not open-ended, nor can it be open-ended.
Another question here that actually was posed to me. So you have in St. Paul saying bad company corrupts good morals in 1 Corinthians 15. How would that relate to this whole subject when you consider the social media, the physical friendships that young people have, and even the schools that they might attend? Bad company corrupts good morals. Could you speak to that?
Well, I'm a boomer, and so I listened to a lot of rock music that was advocating a lot of weird, strange, and wonderful things in the late 60s and the early 70s. And it seems to me that there were like two approaches to that issue. There were those that tried to create a sanctified safety zone where nobody would listen to rock, which was certainly something that could influence the architecture of people's minds. I'm sorry to say that Bob Dylan has probably done more to my head than many other poets may have. So I guess what I'm suggesting is I believe the best approach is not to necessarily ban all contact, but to inoculate our children so that they understand what the issues are and are able to engage in ways that still show integrity as far as what God says in his word. And is that easy? No, I don't think that's the easier course of all at all. But I do think it is the better course to inoculate with the truth, to make sure that with your own children you are able to have the kind of conversations that can deal with such issues and talk about them frankly, and that means a lot of listening on the part of parents. I mean, if we just harangue and we don't listen to where our kids are coming from, we're not going to get very far that way either. On the other hand, though, a consistent confession of the truth is probably going to help our kids think through these issues on their own. Ultimately, I think my position over rock music is that I was able to see, because I had professors who were able to work these things through with me, I was able to see all the flaws and the problems in the ideology much better because I was exposed to it, and yet I had people of integrity guiding me and helping me. It's only when the conversation doesn't exist anymore between parents and children that it gets really, really tough.
Thank you. We do have several questions online still, and maybe we can take two of them. So, Stephen, what do you have for us?
All right. I have to select now. Let's go ahead with Paul Doss asks, I have some brothers in my fraternity who have been brainwashed into believing this. What do you think is the best way for one to try to go about trying to convince others who have bought into this ideology, especially if they are not of the faith? I recall some book talking about transgender studies that were misunderstood as showing proof when really it was not so clear cut. I started reading over a year ago, but even if I remember all the details of the book, my brothers still may close their minds to that. How ought one go about this tough challenge?
I don't know that I'm an apologete or the son of an apologete. All I know is what few bits and bobs I learned as a missionary. The important thing is to be, number one, to know what God's word says, to be very clear on what God's word says in your own mind, to fortify yourself with the gender binary of Genesis 1:26-29. I mean, that's just so vital to see how important this is. to read good books. Read Nancy Percy. She's helpful. Read Abigail Schreier. She is not Christian at all. She's much more and concerned about girls, but it's very helpful to just get the gist of her arguments. But as an approach in trying to dialogue with other people, I guess I would begin by just asking them to speak. I mean, the faculty here at seminary the other day brought some African Americans to speak to us on the issues of race. We heard them speak things from within the context of their own experience, to try to understand as best you can why they feel the way they do and why they think the way they do. A careful and attentive listener might be able to find ways, if you are able to reproduce their own arguments back to them. So you say, what if I hear you right, here's what you're saying. And then if you can feed that back to them and they say, yeah, you got me. Then just ponder that and think, well, are there some questions that you might ask that might lead them to question some of their foundations of thought? I don't know how else you can get away from the brainwash if you don't listen to them first, understand their argument on its terms, why it makes sense to them, and the most ridiculous things, they still make sense to people, and try to understand them, and then come up as you ponder these things with the foundational questions that might lead. I had a discussion with my daughter once. She said to me, and this isn't a good example, it's a bad example, but it's at least an example of what I mean. So she says, Dad, natural law doesn't work anymore. Kids my generation, they're not going to listen to you when you talk natural law. And I said, well, okay, well, then tell me, what does work? How do you think about these things? Well, what is the ethic that everybody espouses? And she says, well, the ethic that everybody lives by is I'm free to do whatever I want to do, so long as I don't hurt anybody. And I just looked at her. And I looked at her. And then she thought about what she had just said. And she says, I suppose it all depends on who defines hurt. And I said, bingo. There you go. What do you think that is? That's natural law, isn't it? How are you going to define hurt except you make appeal to some kind of immanent or transcendent authority that is somehow going to give you the ability to adjudicate between various claims of being hurt? Somebody's got to do that. But it took listening to her and kind of stifling my parental desire to just say, Miriam, you're wrong.
Thank you. We'll take one more minute for one last question, Stephen.
All right, I'm going to get a 2-for-1 here because we've got two that are similar questions. One from Anthony Cavalier and one from Andy Gruen, asking, so from Anthony, any statistics as to how many are suffering with gender dysphoria? And Andy Gruen, counselor talked about getting at the trauma for transgenderism. Are there statistics on Born This Way, i.e. Lady Gaga, versus traumatic experience that causes transgenderism? So they're both kind of looking for statistics as to, I think you gave a 1 in 2,000, but that was for intersex.
That was for intersex.
Yeah.
The statistics on this are constantly changing because of societal pressure. It's sort of like Seneca once said, if you punish or if you talk about a sin a lot, or punish the sin a lot, it's going to occur a lot. I think the discussion that we've been having on this has caused a great deal of people talking about it, thinking about it, especially young, impressionable people. So the statistics are rapidly changing, even among certain segments of society. So it would be difficult for me to point to a specific group. Statistically, because their number is increasing, let me put it that way. And it's hard to distinguish whether someone is born that way or there are people that I really do believe, and I think their cases are relatively rare, but they do occur, where they are not conscious of having ever felt from their earliest youth of being or inhabiting the right body. They've never been conscious of anything else. And so it's not all that are traumatized necessarily by something that's happened. I'm not suggesting that. But I do think what the counselor was getting at with his anecdotal thing is careful listening to people who have experienced this is probably better than a frontal attack. Just to listen to them share their experience in an empathetic and loving way is a good place to start. You don't end there. You have to speak the truth in love. But I think a lot of times we begin by firing the arrows of truth rather than demonstrating the welcoming arms of love to begin with. And that's essentially what I'm encouraging here, not to shade the truth, not to fall, to compromise the truth at all, but to do so in a loving way. I know I'm not answering your question completely, and I'm sorry about that. It's the time I had.
And that's all the time we have. Let's thank Dr. Wendland again.